The paint was
What do you
barely
mean
dry
he's
on the
not
mailbox
there?
when
Find
Brenda,
him!
the HOA president, appeared in my driveway, face contorted in fury. You have exactly 24 hours to remove
Ma'am,
that
do you
unapproved
recognize this
planter,
vehicle
or face a
description?
$1,000 fine. She
I've seen it
shrieked,
around a
pointing a
few
manicured
times, but I
finger
don't
at a
know
small
who
pot
owns
of
it.
hydrangeas. I chuckled, setting down my coffee. Ma'am, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm not in your HOA. That was my first mistake. Brenda immediately pulled out her phone, dialing 911, her voice dripping with self-importance as she reported a trespasser, a property violator, and a clear and present danger to community aesthetics. She stood there, arms crossed, the smug victor, awaiting her backup. She had no idea the house she was screaming, three others nearby were now mine, and that the single entity controlling the very ground her precious community pool sits on was a shell company I had just legally acquired, making me the ultimate power broker she never saw coming. The morning had started out perfectly, crisp and clear, exactly the kind of weather you hope for when tackling minor yard work. I was at the first of the 4 investment properties I'd just closed on. A charming, albeit slightly neglected, ranch-style home on the corner. My goal for the day was simple: trim the overgrown boxwood hedge by the porch, check the irrigation system, and maybe decide on a fresh coat of paint. I had my coffee mug resting safely on the porch railing and the electric shears humming contentedly in my hands. I'd been at it for maybe 20 minutes, focused on getting a clean line across the top, when the silence of the suburban street was shattered not by a loud truck or a barking dog, but by the unmistakable sound of fast, determined footsteps approaching on the asphalt. I looked up and saw her. Brenda, the self-appointed queen of aesthetics, was making her grand entrance. She was impeccably dressed for a confrontation, sporting tailored white shorts, a perfectly ironed polo shirt, and massive sunglasses that hid her eyes but couldn't conceal the sharp, angry line of her jaw. She didn't stop at the edge of the lawn. She marched right into the driveway, stopping only 3 feet from where I stood, the smell of expensive perfume and righteous indignation preceding her. Before I could even offer a polite, "Can I help you?" she launched her attack. "You stop right there. That is not an approved depth for the boxwood recession line. It must conform to Section 4B of the Greenery Covenant, which explicitly states a minimum 3-foot setback from the perimeter sidewalk." I blinked, genuinely confused. The hedge was perhaps 2.5 feet from the sidewalk, and I was just trying to shape it, not rip it out. I set the shears down, realizing this was going to require my full attention, and tried to manage the situation with a dose of casual reality. "Ma'am," I said, leaning against the hedge trimmers, "I just bought the place. I'm just tidying up. I'm not really familiar with your sections and covenants." That's when her face began its terrifying transformation from annoyed to truly enraged, a shade of deep, angry crimson spreading up her neck. She pulled a laminated card from her pocket, the logo of the Oak Hill Preserve Homeowners Association prominently displayed. "I am Brenda Hayes, the current president of the Oak Hill Board. You are in violation, and ignorance is not a defense against the rules of our community." This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment my detailed, late-night due diligence during the acquisition process paid off. The 4 properties I purchased were part of the original, older phase of the development, and unlike the newer homes, the deeds for these 4 had a grandfathered clause allowing the owners to voluntarily opt out of the provided they maintained their property to a general standard that prevented blight. My legal team had ensured I signed no documents agreeing to join. I kept my voice level and polite. "I appreciate you introducing yourself, Branya, but I did not sign a membership agreement with your voluntary association, nor was that membership transferred with the sale. My deed is clear. I am an owner in the development, but I am not a member of the Oak Hill Preserve, HOA. Your rules don't apply to my property." The statement hit her like a physical blow. The color drained from her face, replaced by a mask of pure disbelief. Her entire identity, her power structure, rested on the unquestioned authority of those bylaws, and here was a stranger calmly dismantling her kingdom over a shrub. She stammered, pointing a shaky finger at my front door. That is impossible. Everyone here is governed. This community relies on uniform compliance. You are causing irreparable harm to property values by setting a precedent of slippage." I almost laughed at the dramatic use of slippage, but I held it in. I simply shrugged. "I'm maintaining the property, Brenda. That's the only requirement. If you believe I've violated some municipal code, please call the city. Otherwise, I'm going to finish my hedge." That was the final insult. Her authority utterly disregarded, her judgment questioned. Brenda pulled out her phone, her hands trembling, and in a voice thick with self-importance, she proceeded to dial 911, reporting a hostile trespasser refusing to comply with community law, turning a trivial dispute over 3 inches of landscaping into a police matter. The sound of 2 patrol car sirens, mercifully muted but still noticeable, began to drift down the street about 5 minutes after Brenda's call. She immediately stopped pacing, squared her shoulders, and fixed a triumphant, almost predatory gaze on the approaching vehicles. She looked like a general awaiting her reinforcements. I, meanwhile, used the brief interlude to walk back to my car, retrieve the essential closing binder from the passenger seat, and lean against the cool metal, watching the spectacle unfold. Two young officers, a man and a woman, parked at the curb, got out of their cars, and walked up the driveway. The male officer, who looked slightly older and more weary, immediately asked, "Ma'am, you called 911 about a dispute? You said there was a trespasser." Before I could speak, Brenda launched into an Oscar-worthy performance of civic victory. She spoke rapidly, gesticulating wildly between the hedge, my property, and me. "Officer, thank you for coming. This man is a known aggressor, a defiant property owner who is actively refusing to comply with the established covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Oak Hill Preserve community. He claims he is exempt, which is ludicrous, and he refuses to identify himself. He is committing a clear violation of our aesthetic code, which impacts all 27 homes here. He has been hostile, officer, and frankly, I feel threatened by his blatant disregard for the law." She ended her breathless monologue with a dramatic hand placed over her chest, as if she might faint from the trauma of having to witness an improperly trimmed shrub. The officers exchanged a brief, subtle glance that spoke volumes about the ridiculous nature of their current assignment. The female officer, whose name tag read Mendez, turned to me. "Sir, can you tell us what's happening here?" "She says you're trespassing." I pushed off the car, approached them calmly, and held out the heavy, leather-bound closing binder. "Officers, my name is Alex. I am the legal owner of this property, 1421 Briarwood Lane. As of 3 weeks ago, I am not trespassing, and I have not been hostile. I was simply trimming my hedge when Ms. Hayes decided to escalate a known issue into a police emergency." I opened the binder. Flipping directly to the page, I'd flagged the recorded DID and handed it to the male officer. Furthermore, if she would bother to read the older deeds in this subdivision, she would see that this specific property is not subject to the mandatory membership of the HOA. It is voluntary, and I have opted not to join. This is purely a civil matter concerning a covenant I am not bound by. Officer Mendez took a moment to review the document, pointing to a highlighted paragraph on the deed. Her partner read it, his eyebrows inching higher with every sentence. After confirming the legal status of the property, they handed the documents back. The older officer turned back to Brenda, his professional tone hardening slightly. "Ms. Hayes, the owner, has provided valid documentation confirming he is not trespassing, and furthermore, that he is not bound by the Voluntary Association's specific aesthetic rules. This is not a matter for emergency services. You should not be calling 911 for civil disputes, especially ones that involve covenants that do not apply to the homeowner." Brenda's jaw dropped. The carefully applied layers of her confidence cracked and fell away, leaving her exposed and furious. She sputtered, trying to argue the finer points of community spirit and implied consent. But the officers cut her off with cool finality. They apologized once more to me for the disruption, gave Brenda a stern warning about abusing emergency lines, and returned to their patrol cars, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the driveway, completely and publicly defeated. It was a minor victory, but one that tasted incredibly sweet, and it immediately sparked a new, potent thought. If she was this desperate for control, maybe she wasn't as secure in her power as she seemed. The immediate gratification of watching Brenda get publicly dressed down by the police was enjoyable, but the lasting irritation was profound. It wasn't just the sheer waste of time or the absurdity of the situation, it was the realization that this woman, fueled by nothing more than a minor elected position, believed she could summon the instruments of the state to enforce her personal preferences on my private property. That level of institutional arrogance was something I simply couldn't tolerate. It moved beyond a simple neighborhood squabble and became a challenge to be strategically overcome. I was used to dealing in complex, multi-layered real estate transactions, not arguing about hedge hikes, and I decided to apply my professional scrutiny to her little kingdom. The deep dive began that very afternoon. My initial acquisition had been 4 properties bought as a single portfolio sale from a distant investment trust that was liquidating assets. The file for this sale was enormous, containing not just the deeds for the homes, but also dozens of pages detailing the transfer of various associated assets and liabilities. Most of it was boilerplate, legalese utility, easements, service contracts, and escrow agreements, the kind of documents 99% of buyers simply sign off on without reading past the closing summary. But Brenda's outburst had given me the motivation to read every single line of that boring, dense paperwork. I locked myself in my home office, pulled up the digital files, and began cross-referencing every corporate entity mentioned in the transfer documents with the public records for the Oak Hill Preserve community. The initial findings were exactly as expected. The HOA itself was a non-profit corporation registered in the state, funded entirely by mandatory dues from the rest of the neighborhood, but buried 20 pages deep in a schedule of miscellaneous assets. I found an entry that stopped me cold. The transfer of ownership of Community Facilities LLC. The former seller, the investment trust, had apparently been the original developer of the entire subdivision decades ago, and they had retained ownership of certain common area parcels and infrastructure, leasing them back to the newly formed HOA as an ongoing revenue stream before bundling the remaining entity into my portfolio purchase. It was a classic, arcane real estate maneuver designed to maximize tax benefits for the original developer, and the trust had simply forgotten it was in the pile. My heart began to thump a little faster as I pulled the specific deeds associated with Community Facilities, LLC. What I discovered was far more potent than I could have imagined. This shell company didn't just own a few square feet of forgotten land. It owned every critical non-residential asset in the community. The land beneath the HOA's administrative office and meeting room, mine. The land holding the community pool and accompanying sun deck, mine. The tennis courts, the small playground, and most critically, the physical hardware for the electronic entry gate system at the main entrance, all mine. The HOA was literally operating on borrowed ground, and the paperwork confirmed that they leased these facilities from Community Facilities LLC on a 10-year term. The final piece of this perfectly assembled, beautiful puzzle was the lease schedule. I found the master lease agreement between the Oak Hill Preserve HOA and Community Facilities LLC tucked away in Section 14.c. The expiration date stared back at me in bold typeface. The lease was set to terminate in 30 days, with no automatic renewal clause, only a standard first right of refusal for a renegotiation. I pushed back from my desk, a slow, wide grin spreading across my face. Brenda had called the cops on me over a hedge and an unapproved planter, trying to exercise authority she didn't possess. She had no idea that I, the hostile trespasser, was about to become her community's reluctant and entirely unpredictable landlord, controlling the very foundation of their power and prestige. The game had just changed from property maintenance to corporate chess. 30 days later, exactly at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, I walked into the Oak Hill Preserve Clubhouse meeting room, which was, ironically, land I now technically controlled. The room was sparsely decorated with a long folding table where 5 board members sat, and a scattering of folding chairs occupied by about a dozen other residents, the usual concerned citizens, and Brenda's silent, nodding supporters. At the head of the table sat Brenda, looking particularly smug and proprietorial. As I entered, the hum of small talk immediately died down. Brenda, catching sight of me, stabbed a pen down on her agenda with a sharp, decisive noise, leaning forward with the air of a prosecutor. Mr. Alex, you have not submitted an appearance form for this evening. As a non-member, you are not permitted to address the board or occupy a chair. Please take your non-member self to the back wall and remain silent, or I will have you removed. I offered a polite, measured smile, walked past the empty folding chairs, and placed my briefcase right next to her leather-bound agenda on the table, which earned me a sharp, inhaled gasp. Good evening, Brenda, and members of the board, I began, my voice carrying clearly but calmly over the sudden tension. My name is Alex, and I'm here not as a property owner, but as a representative of a vested interest in the community's infrastructure. Before she could mobilize her outrage, I unlatched the briefcase and pulled out a stack of neatly bound documents, placing the top one titled Notice of Non-Renewal and Intent to Renegotiate directly in front of her. I am the sole director and owner of Community Facilities LLC. The words hung in the air, heavy and bewildering. A few residents in the back began whispering, but the board members remained frozen, staring at the paperwork like it was a live grenade. Brenda's reaction was a stunning mix of denial and panic. She snatched up the document, her eyes frantically scanning for an error, her professional composure finally shattering into sheer terror. This is a forgery. Community Facilities is a subsidiary of the original developer. You can't just claim I cut her off smoothly, pointing to the attached legal appendix. As of 30 days ago, the entire entity was transferred to my holding company. I have included the recorded deeds for parcels A through F, which detailed the land under this building, the pool, the gate system, and the community fields. The master lease agreement with Oak Hill Preserve HOA, which I have also provided a copy of, expires in precisely 1 week, with no automatic renewal. A flurry erupted around the table. The vice president, a nervous man named Gary, snatched the lease copy from Brenda, his face pale as he recognized the document. Brenda, this is true. The lease is expiring. Why did you never mention this at a finance meeting? This wasn't budgeted for Brenda, momentarily abandoned by her peers, uttered a defense that amounted to blaming her predecessor and the complicated paperwork. I let the panic simmer for another 30 seconds, allowing the full reality of their situation to sink in. The woman who obsessed over 3 inches of shrubbery had jeopardized the entire physical foundation of their community. Then, I delivered the fatal blow. Due to a sustained pattern of poor governance, documented financial oversight lapses, and, frankly, the petty, aggressive abuse of power demonstrated by the current leaderships, the frivolous use of emergency services on a homeowner who is not even a member. Facilities LLC has determined that the lease will not be renewed. I stood tall, looking directly at Brenda, whose face had gone from red rage to sickly white fear. It will, however, be open for a rigorous renegotiation, but only when a more stable and professional board is in place. One that can guarantee the landlord that the facility will be managed reasonably and legally. Until then, as of next week, I am legally required to begin decommissioning the assets. This includes turning off the pool filters, locking the clubhouse doors, and, perhaps most inconveniently, disabling the electronic entry gate system. The room exploded into a chorus of panicked questions and demands directed not at me, the threat, but at Brenda, the cause of their impending disaster. The battle had been won the moment the words electronic entry gate system left my mouth. The meeting room instantly devolved into pandemonium, though it was a focused chaos directed entirely at the head of the table. Homeowners who had remained silent under Brenda's iron rule suddenly found their voices, not out of concern for fair governance, but out of absolute terror that their pool would be drained in the middle of a scorching summer and that their coveted gated community status would vanish, leaving the entrance wide open to the public. The gate is going to be disabled. What about security? One resident shrieked, while another demanded to know who was going to pay the enormous fees to have the pool water trucked out if the filters were shut down. Gary, the vice president, saw the writing on the wall faster than anyone. He pounded his gavel, which was usually reserved for silencing dissent on shrubbery issues, and shouted, "Order, we must act." Alex is right, this is a failure of leadership. The board members, desperate to salvage the situation, rapidly held an emergency meeting right there on the dais. Their backs literally turned on Brenda. The consensus was swift and brutal. Brenda was the liability, and she had to be sacrificed. Brenda, realizing she had been stripped of her last shred of support, turned incandescent with rage. Her attempt to defend her tenure, claiming she was protecting the integrity of the vision, was drowned out by Gary shouting a motion to immediately remove her from all board positions and committees for gross financial negligence and dereliction of duty concerning the lease. The vote was 3-1, with Brenda abstaining as she dramatically gathered her papers. She didn't wait for the formal announcement. She snatched her monogrammed purse, muttered a curse about Philistine neighbors and illegal land grabs, and stormed out of the clubhouse that was about to be locked up by the man she had just tried to prosecute. The silence that followed her exit was not one of mourning, but of profound, collective relief, even from the residents who usually brought her cookies. With Brenda gone, sanity returned to the room. Gary, now the acting president, turned to me, his demeanor one of humble supplication. "Alex, we understand. We made a terrible error in judgment. We were focused on the wrong things. We are ready to negotiate, but we need that gate, and we need the pool for the children." I didn't gloat. That wasn't the point. I simply laid out my non-negotiable terms, making it clear this wasn't about extracting an exorbitant rent, but about restoring sanity to the neighborhood. The rent would stay exactly where it was, preventing a financial burden on the homeowners. The cost of the lease was irrelevant. The cost of their bad behavior was the only price I cared about. The conditions for the new 2-year lease were simple. First, an immediate, binding amendment to the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions that would only permit fines for legitimate safety violations, severe property blight, or non-payment of required fees. All fines related to aesthetics, minor paint colors, planters, or specific gardening choices were to be permanently removed from the HOA's punitive powers. Second, the permanent dissolution of the notorious Architectural Review Committee, the body Brenda had weaponized, with its functions being merged into a single, non-punitive maintenance advisory role. The remaining board members reviewed the terms, and one woman, a homeowner who had been fined for putting up a tasteful bird feeder, smiled genuinely for the first time that night. They realized that I, the hostile trespasser, was giving them back their actual freedom, using my unexpected position as their landlord to enforce democracy and common sense. Gary signed the new agreement immediately, and the crisis was averted. The Oak Hill Preserve community was never the same. The gate remained operational, the pool stayed sparkling, and my 4 investment properties thrived. The biggest change wasn't the disappearance of Brenda, who was never seen at another community function, but the palpable quiet shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Lawns were still well kept, but now they featured colorful pots and subtle decorative touches that spoke of individual pride, not mandatory compliance. My hydrangeas remained untouched by the newly empowered, and decidedly more fearful, board. The victory wasn't financial or personal. It was the satisfaction of knowing I had used complex legal maneuvering to defeat petty tyranny and permanently redefine what a homeowners association should be, an organization focused on collective good, not individual power trips. Watch the full video version of this true story on HOA Bright Reality. For more homeowner survival stories and HOA insights, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel.